Topic 6. Navigating everyday life. People with an intellectual disability experience complex needs associated with the combination of personal functioning and communication needs and social experiences of living with intellectual disability, including disadvantage and stigma. Many people with intellectual disability experience some or all of the following: high levels of stress, anxiety and frustration, poor self-esteem and a feeling of being judged, laughed at or ridiculed, feelings and experiences of fearfulness, powerlessness and helplessness, high levels of dependency and thinking that others control their lives, including their choices and their bodies, isolation and exclusion from meaningful relationships and valued social roles. These experiences can result in people with intellectual disability demonstrating challenging behaviours, self-harming, and the onset of mental illness. People with intellectual disability often need support to navigate the complexities of everyday life. To understand the complexities of everyday life for people with intellectual disability, let's look at some common experiences in living situations, relationships, and service systems. The impact of a person's living situation on their well-being is as significant for people with an intellectual disability as it is for anyone else. In fact, the security and appropriateness of a person's accommodation can impact more significantly on a person who has an intellectual disability because they may find it harder to negotiate housing challenges such as difficult neighbours or inaccessibility to transport. Issues in a person's living situation may be related to personal functioning challenges associated with their disability and/or to multiple social disadvantages that people with intellectual disability often experience, such as poverty, discrimination, and social isolation. It is extremely important to be aware of a person's living situation when working with clients with intellectual disability. The vast majority of adults with intellectual disability live independently in the community and do so without service support. People may live alone or in shared housing with friends or family members, or in supported accommodation or a group home. 2012 data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics shows 82% of people with intellectual disability living in households, compared to 16% who live in establishments such as hospitals or nursing homes. 66% of people were living in a family household, and 3/4 of these were younger people aged between 0 and 34 years. Approximately 15% of people lived alone, and these were more likely to be older than those living in family households. 3% of people with intellectual disability were living in a group household. As noted earlier, research demonstrates people with an intellectual disability are at increased risk of homelessness. Experiences of homelessness are often interrelated with other risk factors, such as involvement in the criminal justice system, alcohol and other drug use, poverty, poor physical and mental health, difficulty managing verbal communication, lack of appropriate education and employment opportunities, experiences of exploitation and abuse, and social isolation. Relationships have an enormous influence in the lives of people with an intellectual disability. They have the potential to protect and support, as well as to harm and create risk. Many people with intellectual disability experience restricted social networks. They may have limited friendship experiences due to restricted participation in community life as a result of poverty, stigma, and difficulties with interpersonal relationships. They may have limited experience of workplace relationships due to difficulty accessing employment. Most people, however, have at least one significant adult person in their life, and it is important that support workers gain an understanding of a person's significant relationships where possible. People with intellectual disability experience restricted opportunities for intimate partner relationships. They often experience constraints on their right to engage in sexual relationships as a result of negative attitudes about the sexuality of people with intellectual disability and/or concerns about pregnancy and risk of abuse. Research demonstrates people may conduct their sexual lives in secret, paradoxically increasing their risk of exploitation and abuse. People with intellectual disability may be discouraged or prevented from entering intimate partner relationships, cohabiting or marrying, or having children. Parents with intellectual disability are more likely to become involved in the child protection system and have their children removed from their care. Many people with intellectual disability experience exploitation and abuse in relationships. As in the general population, sexual assault is most likely to be perpetrated by a known person in a familiar location, such as the home or a workplace. A range of factors contribute to the vulnerability of people with intellectual disability to exploitation and abuse in relationships, including difficulties understanding the complicated and abstract nature of intimacy and relationships, limited knowledge and understanding of sex and sexuality, and socialisation of people with intellectual disability to be compliant and accepting of decision-making and control by other people. People with intellectual disability who are socially isolated and in financial distress may be vulnerable to sexual exploitation to meet everyday needs, for example food, accommodation, cigarettes or transport. People with intellectual disability are often involved with multiple service systems associated with experiences of social disadvantage. Involvement in service systems can present challenges for people with intellectual disability, including understanding multiple services and systems, understanding the relationship between systems, finding support and connection outside systems, falling through the gaps between systems, and reduced self-determination and personal development as a result of heavily serviced lives. People with intellectual disability are overrepresented as suspects or alleged offenders in the criminal justice system. Offenders with intellectual disability are more likely to commit relatively minor offences, but to commit these repeatedly, and are more likely to be charged with public order offences. Estimates suggest that up to 35% of young people in juvenile justice detention in Australia experience an intellectual disability in the mild to moderate range. People with intellectual disability are overrepresented in the child protection system, both as parents and as children and young people in out-of-home care. Parents with intellectual disability are more likely to have their children removed into out-of-home care. However, there is no evidence that parents with intellectual disability are any more likely to abuse their children than any other parents. Discrimination against parents with intellectual disability and a lack of appropriate supports contribute significantly to the overrepresentation of parents with intellectual disability in the child protection system. Children and young people with intellectual disability are more likely to experience violence and abuse and are overrepresented in out-of-home care. Young people with intellectual disability exiting out-of-home care face an increased risk of the poor adult life outcomes facing all care leavers as a result of intersecting experiences of intellectual disability and trauma and a lack of support responsive to their needs in or exiting out-of-home care. Despite higher levels of healthcare need, people with intellectual disability often have reduced or impeded access to healthcare services and experience significantly worse health outcomes and lower life expectancies as a result. Research has identified 5 main barriers to providing healthcare to people with intellectual disability, including communication issues, poor history taking by healthcare providers, poor compliance with healthcare plans, a lack of knowledge of common illnesses experienced by people with an intellectual disability, and consultation time restraints. People with intellectual disability may experience reduced capacity to participate in standard clinical assessment processes, which can make diagnosis difficult and restrict access to appropriate healthcare. The majority of people with intellectual disability receive social welfare services. These may include public housing accommodation, Centrelink income support, most commonly the disability support pension, personal and healthcare decision-making by the Office of the Public Guardian, or financial management by the public trustee. People with intellectual disability often need support to access, understand, and comply with the requirements of social welfare services, including support to complete paperwork, attend appointments, read correspondence, and understand and meet obligations. Sometimes information that a person receives the disability support pension or is subject to public guardian or public trustee orders may be the initial indicator that a person has an intellectual disability. Respectfully and sensitively asking people why they receive this payment or are subject to these orders can provide an opening for them to discuss their experience of intellectual disability. The presence of intellectual impairment does not mean a person cannot make decisions. People with intellectual disability can express their likes and dislikes, needs and wants, and make decisions and choices about their lives just like anyone else. It is essential that people involved in the support of a person with an intellectual disability understand the individual well enough to know how they best communicate their preferences. This can be challenging and requires time and commitment to building a good relationship with the person and others who know them well. Some people with intellectual disability may need support, occasionally or regularly, to make decisions about their lives and personal affairs. For many people, decision-making support is provided informally by the significant people in their lives, including family members, partners, friends and service providers. Some people with intellectual disability receive formal decision-making support from a legally appointed guardian. In Queensland, guardians are appointed by the Queensland Civil and Administration Tribunal, or QCAT. Family members, close friends, professionals, or anyone with a genuine and continuing interest in the welfare of an adult with impaired decision-making capacity can apply to be appointed as a guardian. Guardians must be over 18 years of age and not a paid carer for the adult. That is, not receiving remuneration or payment other than a carer payment or government benefit payment. A public guardian may be appointed where there is no one close to the adult who is willing to accept the responsibility of being their guardian, or there is a dispute about who should act as a guardian, or a concern about the suitability or competence of a proposed guardian. Guardians are given the legal authority to make decisions on behalf of the adult, such as where they live, what support services they receive, with whom they have contact or visits, decisions about general healthcare matters, decisions about restrictive practices, including the approval of chemical, physical or mechanical restraint, the approval of containment and seclusion in certain limited circumstances, restricting access to objects, and decisions about other day-to-day issues. If the adult can communicate their views and wishes, guardians should take these into account when making any decisions. When working with a person with intellectual disability, it is important to learn about any decision-making supports in the person's life, both informal and formal. It may be important to engage decision-making supports during the course of your work with a person, but always seek their permission before you do this, and advocate for and support the person's involvement in decision-making processes. Where a person with intellectual disability does not have any decision-making supports, but their lived experiences suggest these could help the person to better achieve their hopes, dreams, and personal well-being, service providers and supporters are encouraged to talk with the person about their choices and preferences, and explore the type of decision-making support that could be helpful to them. Wherever possible, supported decision-making, that is, supporting the person to consider their options, weigh potential consequences, and make their own choices, is preferable to substitute decision-making, that is, making decisions on behalf of another person. The New South Wales Intellectual Disability Rights Service advises the following principles should guide the use of decision-making support with people with intellectual disability. The wishes, opinions and choices of the person must always be sought and considered first. The privacy, cultural diversity and integrity of the person must always be respected. The least restrictive and intrusive intervention into the person's life should be used. The ability to make decisions is a fluid concept that may vary from time to time and from decision to decision. Diminished decision-making ability should not be confused with difficulties or impairment in communication,
and people should be provided adjustments and alternative modes of communication to express themselves. Substitute decision-making is an absolute last resort. Records must always be kept about supported and substitute decision-making arrangements and decisions made to ensure processes are transparent, subject to independent review, and if necessary to appellate review by courts. Informal arrangements and support from family members, carers or friends who have a close and continuing relationship with the person are preferable to formal orders of guardianship and financial management. And support provided to the person to make decisions must always be in the best interests and welfare of the person.
Topic 6 has focused on some of the everyday life complexities and challenges experienced by people with intellectual disability. However, it is important to remember the main aim of our work is to support people with intellectual disability to enjoy meaningful and fulfilling lives, including participation in valued roles, for example paid work and parenting, having positive relationships with family, friends, colleagues and community members, living in accommodation of their choosing, either alone or with a flatmate of their choice, and healing from past experiences of trauma and abuse where these have occurred. To support a person with intellectual disability to live a good life of their choosing, it is important for service providers and support people to build a strong relationship with the person and get to know what their hopes and dreams are, along with their fears and challenges. It is also helpful to get to know the important people in their life. From a base of deep knowledge of the person's goals and needs, and with the right supports developed and implemented, people with intellectual disability can navigate the complexities of everyday life, and may find some of the complexity is removed altogether. Thank you for listening to Topic 6. Please return to the homepage and complete the Topic 6 learning activity. At the conclusion of this activity, you have completed Module 1, Understanding Intellectual Disability.